Welcome back. Let's move on to the ventricles in our brain. Within our brain itself, there are cavities called the ventricles. There are 4 ventricles, 2 lateral ventricles, a linear type 3rd ventricle, and a reservoir type 4th ventricle. The ventricles make and store cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid bathes and nourishes our brain and spinal cord, and an imbalance in CSF is detrimental to the health of structures it is supposed to nourish, which leads to a severe health concern for the patient. As promised, these next few slides are going to detail the function of the anatomical structures we recently discussed. Beginning with the cerebrum, it's divided into right and left hemispheres. The gyri bulge on the surface, and sulci are the shallow indentations between the bulges. The fissures are what you likely attribute to brain tissue the most, and they are the deep furrows that you can see. Each hemisphere has 4 paired lobes. Each lobe has a specific function. I don't necessarily expect you to memorize these lobes specifically, because memorization of structures does little more than get you through an exam. Rather, you try to understand the lobes. I know some of this information gets a little heavy, but just think how much more you can contribute and appreciate and anticipate when you know why and not just what. When we start talking about procedures and we do a craniotomy of the parietal lobe, you can see why it's a major concern that the patient is able to talk after their procedure. Here you see that the frontal lobe is responsible for thoughts and behavior. A tumor growth in this region of the brain could lead to altered thoughts or abnormal behaviors. We can only hope that a resection of the frontal lobe tumor would restore the normal function of the frontal lobe. Tumors in the occipital lobe could be affecting someone's ability to see. Resecting their tumor could restore their vision. How cool is that? The cerebrum takes about 88% of the entire brain, which ultimately controls all motor activity and sensory impulses. On this slide, you can see the different lobes of the cerebrum, their locations, and their responsibilities. What's important to note here is although the image is colored for you to signify the different lobes, all of these lobes are composed of gray matter. We just talked about the difference between white and gray matter. Do you remember what the difference is? I do hope you're taking good notes. We talked about how white matter is primarily neurons that are transmitting information at high rates, while gray matter are slightly different neurons that are processing that information. Isn't it perfectly understandable then that our cerebral cortex would be composed of tissue that is designed to process information it receives so that we can think and feel and remember, smell, hear, see, express emotion, taste, communicate? I don't know about you, but the human body never ceases to amaze me. Next up in our awesome anatomy analysis is the cerebellum. The cerebellum has several nicknames, including hindbrain and little brain. It's connected to the brainstem, the spinal cord, and the cerebrum by the pons. The cerebellum's anterior and posterior lobes work together to coordinate voluntary muscles, maintain balance and muscle tone, and control our movement. At the base of the cerebellum is the flocculonodular lobe, which is responsible for equilibrium. Coordination between the cerebrum, where information is processed, and the cerebellum is critical for the planning and execution of movement. We talked about the diencephalon early as being considered either part of the brainstem or a 4th section of the brain. As you'll recall, we're studying the brain with the diencephalon as its own section of the brain. So, the diencephalon is found between the cerebrum and the brainstem and includes the thalamus and hypothalamus. Although these two names sound similar, they are very different. The hypothalamus gets its name simply because it's located directly under the thalamus. Other than that, they do not do the same things. The thalamus is a 2-lobed structure that has a lobe under each hemisphere of the cerebrum. It sorts and redirects sensory input, so the special senses like seeing, sense of touch, taste, smell, hearing. Each of these are sensory stimuli, and the thalamus helps us to make sense of it all as the information is received by the eyes, skin, tongue, nose, and ears, and is transmitted through the peripheral nervous system and reaches this thalamus hub in our brain. Our brain then interprets the information and subsequently coordinates our response. We see it, we hear it, we feel it, we taste it, we smell it. Does it amaze you like it amazes me? The hypothalamus is a hub for the endocrine system. The posterior pituitary and the pineal gland live here. They are controlled by the hypothalamus. These two glands ultimately maintain homeostasis and control our autonomic nervous system. The pituitary secretes hormones that maintain homeostasis and regulate growth and development. The pineal gland regulates our sleep cycles by secreting the hormone melatonin. Below the diencephalon is the beginning of the brainstem. The brainstem is divided into three sections. The superiormost portion is the midbrain. The midbrain connects the cerebrum to the lower portions of the brain. The midbrain is responsible for our reflexes regarding our sensory stimulation. So when you hear a sound and you react and look at where the sound came from, that's this portion of the brain working. Below the midbrain is the pons. We already talked about the pons a little while ago, and remember it is mostly white matter, which is busy transmitting messages from the medulla to the midbrain. It is a connection point to the cerebellum, and it helps with regulating autonomic functions like breathing. The final portion of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata, which is the communication hub for the spinal cord and the rest of the brainstem. It is such an important structure due to its involvement with regulating respirations, heartbeat, circulation, and communicating whatever the spinal cord sends its way. All impulses in and out of the brain and spinal cord go through the medulla. The brain requires substantially more oxygen than any other structure in the body. Ultimately, 20% of our oxygen is spent in the brain tissues alone, and the brain only weighs 3 pounds. If you think about how much you weigh and how small your brain is in comparison, and that all the rest of your body shares 80% of the oxygen, that's pretty crazy. In order to achieve this feat, the circulatory structures of the brain are unlike the rest of the body. The brain receives its blood supply from 4 major arteries. They are the right and left internal carotid arteries and the right and left vertebral arteries. This image labels the right carotid and the left vertebral only, but the left carotid and the right vertebral are there too. They're just on the other side. These 4 arteries converge in the center of the brain and form a loop, kind of like a roundabout in traffic, called the circle of Willis. Inside the circle of Willis, oxygenated blood passes through the various brain tissues. The purpose this serves is so that if there is a clot or an aneurysm here, the body can compensate for a small period of time using this loop so that only a small portion of brain tissue is affected, as opposed to an entire hemisphere of the brain. Continuing with our extensive anatomy tour, we are going to discuss the spinal column and how it is designed to house the spinal cord. The spinal column, otherwise known as the vertebral column, provides structural support from the spinal cord. Each vertebrae has a body with a circular opening through which the spinal cord passes. Children are born with separate sacral and coccygeal vertebrae, but during adolescence they begin to fuse and are completely fused by adulthood. Each vertebra is separated by cartilage cushions called discs. Each vertebra has a name and location, and we can locate them by using the numerical designation and by the portion of the spine that they are. You know the spine is a curved structure. So initially it curves outward in the cervical spine. And then it transitions to an inward curvature in the thoracic spine. And then it curves outward again in the lumbar region. And then it terminates at the sacrum and coccyx. As indicated by your slide, there are seven cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. Before you let me continue, make sure you can answer the 2 questions below. Here you see an image of cervical vertebra. Notice how it is indicated that this could be one of the levels between C3 and C7. That's because C1 and C2 are highly specialized cervical vertebrae, and I'll discuss them in just a moment. These levels are the smallest of the true vertebrae and are easy to spot on X-ray because they have a foramen in each transverse process for the vertebral arteries to pass through. The thoracic and lumbar vertebrae don't have these foramen. Please pay attention to how this picture is oriented. This is the image of someone's vertebra if they are facing you. The round vertebral body is toward the center of their body. There is a small section of bone that connects the vertebral body to the lamina, and that's the pedicle. The pedicle is going to be really important in the lumbar spine. The lamina is part of the vertebral wall that surrounds the spinal cord and protects it. And the spinous process is at the top of the picture or towards the back of the person facing you. The lamina can develop bone spurs, and those can impinge the spinal cord, leading to spine surgery. C1 and C2 are in their own category because they can rotate. The rest of the cervical spine can only flex and extend. C1 is coined the atlas, and C2 the axis. After the cervical levels come the thoracic, followed by the lumbar. The thoracic and lumbar levels don't have the foramen for the vertebral arteries, but they still have the vertebral body, pedicle, lamina, and spinous processes. The foramen on this picture is where the spinal cord would travel through. The facet joint is where the vertebrae articulate with one another. So this is a single vertebra, and you're looking at it from the top. But what you can't really see are the 2 small downward facing bony processes that articulate with the vertebra below it. That's how they actually stack upon one another. The vertebral body will have a spongy disc separating them from one another. Any portion of the spinal cord can become impinged if the disc herniates between the layers or the bony structures develop a bone spur.